I'm Natalie Crawford, 32 years old. And right now, I'm sitting across from my parents in the living room of my modest two-bedroom house in suburban Portland, Oregon. They just dropped a bomb that's making my hands shake. They want me to sign over my house deed to them. They already gave my golden child brother Blake a nearly $1 million mansion in Lake Oswego last year. Now they're claiming they need my small $180,000 home for what they call family investments. My mother's eyes are cold as steel. My father won't even meet my gaze. Blake is smirking from the doorway like he's already won. The unsigned paperwork sits on my coffee table between us, and I can feel my whole life balancing on the edge of what I'm about to say. I grip the arms of my chair and whisper the single word that will shatter everything. No. Before I tell you how I got here and what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Have you ever had family try to take advantage of you? Hit that like button if you think standing up for yourself matters. And subscribe, because this story is about to get intense. Trust me, you won't believe what my family did when I refused to hand over everything I'd worked for. Growing up in the Crawford household meant understanding your place, and mine was always second. Blake was 3 years older, and from the moment he could walk, he was the star of every room he entered. He played varsity football, brought home straight A's without even trying, and had that easy charm that made my parents light up whenever he spoke. I was the difficult daughter, the one who asked too many questions, who wanted to paint instead of play sports, who never quite measured up no matter how hard I tried. I remember being 14 and finally making the honor roll after studying myself sick for months. I ran home so excited to tell them, and my mother glanced up from her magazine long enough to say, "That's nice, dear," before turning to my father to brag about Blake getting recruited by 3 different colleges. That was the moment I realized it'd never be enough for them, not because I wasn't accomplished, but because I wasn't Blake. The pattern continued through everything. When Blake turned 16, our parents surprised him with a brand new Honda Accord with a giant red bow on top. They threw a party and invited the whole neighborhood to celebrate. When I turned 18 2 years later, they gave me a used 10-speed bicycle they'd found at a garage sale and told me it would be good exercise. College was even worse. They paid full tuition for Blake to attend a prestigious private university, covered his housing, gave him spending money, and bought him a laptop and everything he needed. When it was my turn, they sat me down and explained that they'd already stretched themselves thin with Blake's education, so I'd need to take out student loans if I wanted to go anywhere. I ended up at the state school, working 3 part-time jobs just to cover what the loans didn't, eating ramen most nights, while Blake posted pictures on social media of his fraternity formal dinners and spring break trips to Cancun. Every achievement I managed to scrape together was met with polite disinterest, while Blake's mediocre accomplishments were celebrated like he'd won the Nobel Prize. Then came the mansion. 6 months ago, my parents called a family meeting and announced with huge smiles that they'd bought Blake a house. Not just any house, but a stunning craftsman-style home in Lake Oswego, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the Portland area. The market value was $950,000. I sat there in shock as they showed us pictures on my father's phone. This gorgeous place with vaulted ceilings, a gourmet kitchen, a master suite bigger than my entire house, and a backyard that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The reason they gave was that Blake needed space for his growing family, even though he only had 1 child at the time and his wife Melanie was already driving a Range Rover and posting about their annual vacations to Maui. I tried to be happy for him. I really did. But all I could think about was how I'd been killing myself to save up for a down payment on a small house for 5 years while working as a freelance graphic designer with unpredictable income. When I asked quietly if they might be able to help me too someday, my mother Patricia patted my hand like I was a child and said, "Of course, sweetie. We'll help you when the time is right," but that time apparently never came. What they didn't know was that I'd already done it myself. 5 years ago, I'd finally saved enough for a down payment on a small 2-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood. It cost $175,000 and needed work, but it was mine. I'd scrape together every penny, working sometimes 70 hours a week, skipping vacations, driving a car that was older than my relationship with my ex-boyfriend, just to make it happen. I didn't tell my parents until after closing because I knew they'd find some way to make it about Blake, or tell me I was being irresponsible. When I finally showed them, my mother looked around with this pinched expression and said, "Well, it's cozy," which was her way of saying it wasn't good enough. My father just nodded and changed the subject. But I didn't care, because for the first time in my life, I had something that was completely mine, something I'd earned without their help or approval. I spent months fixing it up myself, painting every wall, refinishing the hardwood floors on my hands and knees, planting a garden in the backyard with tomatoes and herbs and flowers. Every nail I hammered and every wall I painted was proof that I didn't need them, that I could build a life without being the golden child. That's why when they called 3 weeks ago asking to come over for a family meeting, I felt my stomach drop. My parents never just visited. They only showed up when they wanted something. My father Richard sounded uncomfortable on the phone, talking too fast and laughing at nothing. My mother Patricia was all business, saying they had important family matters to discuss, and could they come by on Saturday afternoon. I said yes because saying no to Patricia Crawford was something I'd never quite learned how to do, even at 32. Saturday came and they arrived right on time, both of them dressed like they were going to a business meeting instead of their daughter's house. Then Blake's car pulled up behind theirs and my heart sank further. He hadn't been invited as far as I knew, but there he was with Melanie, both of them walking up to my door like they owned the place. They all filed into my small living room, my parents taking the couch, Blake and Melanie sitting in the chairs. I'd refinished myself, and me standing there feeling like a stranger in my own home. That's when Patricia reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a manila folder. And I knew whatever was about to happen was going to change everything. Patricia laid the folder on my coffee table with the kind of careful precision that made my skin crawl. She opened it slowly, revealing a stack of legal documents with tiny print and official-looking seals. My father Richard sat beside her, looking everywhere except at me. His hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. Blake leaned back in my chair with this satisfied smirk on his face like he was watching his favorite show, and Melanie examined her manicure with studied disinterest. Patricia looked up at me with those cold blue eyes and said, "We need you to sign over your house to the family trust." And the words hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward. For a moment I thought I'd heard her wrong, that maybe the stress of work had finally made me lose my mind. But then my father cleared his throat and added in this weak voice that it was for everyone's benefit, really, and I realized this was actually happening. I sat down hard in the remaining chair, my legs suddenly unable to hold me. "What family trust?" I asked, and my voice sounded strange and far away. "What are you talking about?" Patricia launched into this explanation that sounded rehearsed, probably because it was. She said they were creating a family real estate portfolio, a trust that would hold properties for the benefit of all family members and ensure long-term financial security for everyone. Blake's mansion was already in the trust, she explained, and now they needed to add my house for equity purposes. They would manage both properties, she said, making financial decisions that would maximize what she kept calling family benefit. She used words like optimization and strategic asset allocation and generational wealth, and the more she talked, the more I realized what she was really saying. They wanted complete control over everything I'd worked for. They wanted to take the one thing I'd accomplished on my own and absorb it into their master plan where Blake was always the center and I was always the supporting character. I asked them to explain what they meant by managing the properties. And that's when the real plan started to emerge. Blake needed capital for a new business venture, Patricia said, glancing at him with obvious pride. He was launching a tech startup, something innovative that would revolutionize the industry. She used those exact words. The startup needed significant investment, And the smartest way to raise that capital was to leverage the family's real estate holdings. They planned to take out equity loans against both properties, Blake's mansion and my little house. The mansion would provide substantial borrowing power, obviously. But my house had something valuable too. It'd been aggressively paying down my mortgage for 5 years, putting every extra dollar toward the principal because I hated being in debt. That meant I had significant equity built up, probably $60,000 or $70,000 at this point. They saw that equity as family money, as something they could access and use for Blake's benefit. My mother actually used the phrase, our collective resources, like my years of sacrifice and 70-hour work weeks were somehow a team effort. I felt anger starting to build in my chest, hot and sharp. "This is my house," I said, and I was proud that my voice stayed steady. "I bought it myself. I've paid every single mortgage payment myself. This isn't family property, it's mine." Patricia's expression didn't change. She said, "Family shares, Natalie, and that's what makes us strong." Blake leaned forward and added, "Don't be selfish, Nat, it'd do it for you." And I almost laughed because Blake had never done anything for anyone except himself in his entire life. The golden child who got everything handed to him was calling me selfish for not wanting to hand over the one thing it earned. Melanie finally looked up from her nails and said, "We're all in this together," which was rich coming from someone who married into the family 5 years ago and contributed nothing except expensive taste and social media posts about their perfect life. Then came the guilt trip. And Patricia Crawford could guilt trip like it was an Olympic sport. She sat back and folded her hands and said, "After everything we've done for you, Natalie, you can't do this one thing for your family?" She started listing things. How they gave me life, raised me, put a roof over my head, let me live at home during college summers when I had nowhere else to go. She conveniently forgot to mention that I'd paid them rent those summers, that I'd bought my own food and done my own laundry and basically took care of myself while Blake came and went as he pleased without contributing a dime. She made it sound like I owed them some enormous debt that could never be repaid, like signing over my house was the least I could do after all their sacrifices. My father tried a softer approach, his voice almost pleading as he said, "Just think about it, sweetheart. Sleep on it. We're not trying to pressure you." But Patricia cut him off immediately and said, "Actually, we need an answer today," and her tone made it clear this wasn't a request or a discussion. It was a demand with a ticking clock. I looked around at all of them sitting in my living room, in the house I'd bought and fixed up and made into a home, and something crystallized in my mind. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a resource, a bank account they could tap whenever Blake needed something. My whole life I'd been trying to earn their love and approval, working myself sick to prove I was worth something, and here was the truth staring me in the face. It would never be enough. I could give them everything I had, and they'd still look at me with disappointment, while Blake got praised for breathing. The anger in my chest was spreading now, filling my whole body with this fierce heat that felt like power. I stood up and looked at my mother and said no. Just that one word. No. Patricia's face turned to stone. Blake let out this sharp laugh and said, "You're making a huge mistake, sis." Richard looked disappointed, but said nothing, just sat there like always, letting Patricia run the show. Melanie whispered something to Blake and they shared this knowing look that made my skin crawl. They left within 5 minutes. Patricia stood up and gathered her papers without a word, shoving them back into the folder with sharp, angry movements. She paused at my front door and said, "You'll regret this disrespect, Natalie, mark my words." Blake stopped beside her and added, "Hope you don't need any family help anytime soon." And there was this threatening edge to his voice that I'd never heard before. Then they were gone, my father trailing behind them without even saying goodbye, and I was alone in my house that suddenly felt different, like something had shifted in the air. I locked the door behind them and my hands were shaking so hard I could barely turn the deadbolt. I slid down to sit on the floor, with my back against the door, and just breathed, trying to process what had just happened. I'd said no to my parents for maybe the first time in my adult life, And instead of feeling good about it, I felt terrified. Because I knew Patricia Crawford, and I knew she didn't take no for an answer. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The silence in my house after they left felt heavy and strange. I sat on my living room floor for probably 20 minutes, just staring at the wall I'd painted sage green last summer, the one with the floating shelves I'd installed myself to hold my collection of vintage cameras. Everything looked the same but felt different, like the safety ID built here had been compromised somehow. I finally pulled myself up and went to the kitchen to make tea, my hands still trembling as I filled the kettle. My phone buzzed on the counter and I jumped. It was a text from my mother. One line. "Your father and I are very disappointed in you." I stared at it for a long moment, then turned my phone face down, and tried to ignore the guilt that automatically rose up in my chest. That guilt was trained into me over 32 years. The constant feeling that I was letting them down, that I wasn't good enough, that I should try harder to make them happy, but underneath the guilt was something new, something harder. Anger and determination. This was my house, my life, and I wasn't giving it up. The real consequences started within 24 hours. I woke up Sunday morning to my phone exploding with notifications. The family group chat, the one that included my parents, Blake, Melanie, and all my aunts, uncles, and cousins, was going crazy. I opened it with a sense of dread and started scrolling through messages. My mother had sent a long text at 7 in the morning, clearly timed for when everyone would be having breakfast and checking their phones. She'd written that she and my father had tried to include me in an important family financial planning initiative, something that would benefit everyone, but I had refused to participate and had been extremely disrespectful in the process. She made it sound like they'd been offering me an opportunity and I'd thrown it back in their faces. She said she was heartbroken that her own daughter would be so selfish and ungrateful after everything they'd sacrificed for me over the years. The messages that followed were brutal. "Aunt Carol," wrote Natalie. "How could you? Your mother is in tears." Cousin Jennifer, who had been close to growing up, said, "I'm really disappointed in you. I thought you were better than this." Uncle Raymond sent, "I guess family doesn't mean anything to you." On and on it went. Dozens of messages from people who had no idea what had actually happened, all taking my parents' side without even asking me for my version of events. I tried to respond, typing out a message explaining that my parents had asked me to sign over my house, and I'd simply declined, but before I could hit send, Blake posted in the chat. He wrote, "Look, I didn't want to get into this publicly, but since it's out there, everyone should know that Mom and Dad have been incredibly generous to both of us and all they asked was for Nat to contribute to a family investment opportunity. She refused because apparently she only cares about herself." Then Melanie added, "Sometimes family disappoints you, and you have to accept who people really are." I deleted my unsent message because I realized nothing I said would matter. They'd already controlled the narrative. I was the villain in a story they'd written, and no amount of truth would change that. Blake even posted a vague status on Facebook that afternoon that said, "Sometimes the people you'd do anything for won't do the smallest thing for you." Disappointed but not surprised. His friends and colleagues flooded the comments with support, telling him he deserved better, asking if he was okay. They had no idea he was talking about me refusing to hand over my house so he could fund his startup with my equity. The social isolation was immediate and brutal. Cousin Jennifer stopped responding to my texts. We'd been talking almost daily, sending each other memes and making plans to meet up for lunch, and suddenly, I was left on read. Aunt Carol called me Monday afternoon and I answered, hoping she wanted to hear my side, but instead she launched into this lecture about how family is everything and I was destroying it. She said my mother was so heartbroken she couldn't get out of bed, which I knew was manipulative nonsense because Patricia Crawford had never been too heartbroken to do anything. Uncle Raymond left me a voicemail saying I needed to apologize and make this right before I damaged relationships beyond repair. I tried calling Jennifer back, tried explaining to Carol, tried to reach out to anyone who would listen, but no one wanted to hear it. They'd decided I was the problem, and that was that. By Tuesday, it'd been effectively cut off from my entire extended family. The group chat continued without me. Everyone commiserating about how sad the situation was and how they hoped it'd come to my senses. I muted the chat but couldn't bring myself to leave it, some pathetic part of me still hoping someone would ask for my side of the story. Then things got worse. I work as a freelance graphic designer, which means my income depends on maintaining good relationships with clients and getting referrals. I have about 15 regular clients who keep me busy with ongoing work, and am always looking for new projects to add to the roster. Wednesday morning, I got an email from one of my best clients, a small marketing agency that gave me steady work. The email was short and professional, saying they appreciated our past collaboration but they'd decided to go in a different direction and wouldn't be needing my services anymore. I was confused because we'd just had a great meeting the week before about upcoming projects, but I sent back a polite response and moved on. Then Thursday, another client canceled. This one was a financial consulting firm I'd been working with for 3 years. The owner called me personally and sounded uncomfortable. He said, "Natalie, I have to be honest with you. Your mother reached out to me and mentioned you were going through some personal issues and might not be able to deliver work on time. I know she was trying to help, but we can't risk delays right now, so we're going to pause our contract." My stomach dropped. I tried to explain that I wasn't going through any issues and could absolutely deliver on time like I always had, but had already made up his mind. He said maybe we could reconnect in a few months when things settled down. I hung up feeling sick. A third client just ghosted me completely. We'd been emailing about a website redesign project and suddenly she stopped responding. I sent follow-ups, even tried calling. Nothing. Later I found out through a mutual connection that my mother had contacted her too, saying similar things about me being unreliable. Patricia Crawford knew several of my clients through her social and professional connections. She'd moved in Portland society circles for decades, and she was using those connections to destroy my livelihood. By Friday, I'd lost 3 clients, which represented about 30% of my monthly income. I sat at my desk in the spare bedroom I used as an office, and tried not to panic. I had savings. I could weather this for a while, but if she kept going, I'd be in real trouble. The house I'd fought so hard to keep might become impossible to afford if I couldn't pay the mortgage. I realized with growing horror that this was probably part of their plan. Make it so I couldn't afford to keep the house, then swoop in with an offer to help in exchange for signing it over. It was calculated and cruel and exactly like my mother. Saturday afternoon I was in my garden trying to calm down by pulling weeds when I heard a car pull up. I looked up and saw my parents' SUV, and behind it, Blake's Tesla. My heart started pounding. They got out and walked toward me, and I stood up, trowel in hand like some kind of pathetic weapon. Patricia's face was cold as ice. Richard wouldn't look at me. Blake had his phone out, recording. "My mother said we came to talk some sense into you. And I said you need to leave. I have nothing to say to you." That's when Blake held up his phone and said, "You're being recorded, just so you know. We want documentation of your behavior." I felt violated and angry and scared all at once. I walked toward my front door and said, "Get off my property. I'm serious." They followed me. Patricia said, "We're your parents. We have a right to be here." I turned around and said, "No, you don't. This is my house and you're not welcome." Blake said, "We tried to do this the nice way." And my mother added, "You're making this so much harder than it needs to be, Natalie." I pulled out my phone and started dialing 911, and that's when they finally backed off. Patricia said, "You'll regret this. You'll see we were right." And then they left. I stood on my porch shaking, watching them drive away, and called my best friend Stella, because I couldn't do this alone anymore. Stella Rodriguez had been my best friend since college, one of the few people who knew my family dynamics and didn't judge me for them. She was also an attorney specializing in family law and estate disputes, which meant she understood exactly how bad this situation could get. I called her Saturday evening after my parents left, and she came over immediately with a bottle of wine and a legal pad. We sat at my kitchen table and I told her everything. The demand for my house. The family smear campaign. The client's I'd lost. The confrontation that afternoon. Stella listened without interrupting, but I could see her getting angrier with every detail. When I finished, she said, "This is financial abuse, Nat, and it's not okay. None of this is okay." She asked if I had documentation of everything, and I realized I didn't. I'd been too shocked and overwhelmed to think about evidence. She told me to start immediately. Screenshot every text message, every email, every social media post. Write down dates and times of every interaction. Save voicemails. Document the client's ID lost, and any proof that my mother had contacted them. She said we need to build a case because this isn't going to stop until we make it stop. I spent Sunday gathering everything I could find. I screenshotted the family group chat messages and Blake's Facebook posts. I wrote a detailed timeline of events starting with the Saturday meeting when they demanded my house. I pulled phone records showing calls from my parents and relatives. I drafted emails to the client's ID lost, asking them to confirm in writing why they'd ended our contracts, though I doubted they'd respond honestly. Stella came back over Sunday evening and reviewed everything. She said it was a good start, but we needed more financial documentation. She asked if I had proof that I'd bought my house entirely on my own, that my parents had never contributed anything. I said yes, absolutely, and pulled out the folder where I kept all my important documents, bank statements from 5 years ago showing my savings account that I'd built up to $25,000 for the down payment, the loan application and approval, all in my name. 5 years of mortgage statements, every single one paid on time from my checking account. Stella photographed everything with her phone and said, "This is solid, they have no legal claim to your house whatsoever." Then, 2 weeks after ID refused to sign over my house, the lawyer's letter arrived. It came by certified mail on a Wednesday morning, and I had to sign for it. The return address was Thompson and Associates, a law firm in downtown Portland that I knew was expensive because their office was in one of the fancy high-rises. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages long on heavy cream-colored paper with raised letterhead. It was addressed to me from an attorney named Marcus Thompson, and the subject line said "Notice of Financial Claim." I sat down on my couch and started reading. The letter stated that my parents, Richard and Patricia Crawford, were making a formal claim against me for monies they had provided toward the purchase of my home. According to the letter, they had given me $15,000 as a gift to help with my down payment 5 years ago, and this gift had been made with the verbal understanding that the house would be considered part of the family estate. The letter claimed that I was now in violation of that agreement, and they were demanding either immediate repayment of the $15,000 or transfer of partial ownership of the property to them in lieu of cash repayment. I had 30 days to respond or they would file a lawsuit. I read the letter 3 times, feeling sicker with each pass. It was completely fabricated. My parents had never given me $15,000 or any amount of money for my house. I'd saved every penny myself, working multiple jobs, skipping vacations, living as cheaply as possible for years. But the letter made it sound so official and legitimate, with legal language about verbal agreements and implied contracts and equitable relief. The worst part was that I couldn't prove a negative. How do you prove you didn't receive money? They could claim they gave me cash and there would be no record. It would be my word against theirs. I immediately called Stella, and she told me to come to her office right away. I drove there in a daze, the letter clutched in my hand. Stella read it carefully, her jaw getting tighter with each paragraph. When she finished, she looked up and said, "This is absolute garbage, Nat. They're making this up and they know it." She asked if there was any possibility, any chance at all, that they'd given me money I'd forgotten about. I said absolutely not. I would remember $15,000. That's not something you forget. She nodded and said, then we prove it. We spent the next 2 hours going through my financial records from 5 years ago. I'd kept everything because I was obsessive about documentation, never imagining I'd need it to defend myself against my own parents. We pulled up old bank statements online and printed them out. There it was, clear as day. My savings account building slowly over 4 years from my various jobs. $25,300 in the account the month before I bought the house. Then a withdrawal of exactly $25,000 for the down payment and closing costs. No mysterious $15,000 deposit at any point. No unexplained cash infusions. Every dollar accounted for and traceable to my own paychecks. Stella organized it all into a timeline, highlighting the relevant transactions. She said, well, send this to their attorney with a cease and desist letter. Make it clear that any lawsuit they file will be immediately dismissed and they'll be liable for your legal fees. She was confident, but I was terrified. Even if we won, even if we proved they were lying, this was my family. They were willing to commit fraud to take my house. How had it come to this? Before we could send the response letter, things escalated again. Saturday morning, I was in my kitchen making coffee when I heard car doors slamming outside. I looked out the window and my heart sank. My parents' SUV was parked in front of my house, along with Blake's Tesla and another truck I didn't recognize. They were all getting out and walking toward my front door. I quickly pulled out my phone and opened the recording app, then went to the door. I didn't open it. I called through it and said, "What do you want?" Patricia's voice came back sharp and commanding. "We're exercising our property rights. Natalie, open this door." I said, "You have no property rights, this is my house." That's when I heard Blake's voice saying, "We brought a locksmith." My stomach dropped. I yanked open the door and there they were. My parents, Blake, and a guy in a work uniform holding a toolbox. Blake had his phone out recording again. I stepped outside and pulled my door shut behind me, locking it. I said, "Nobody is changing any locks. You need to leave right now." Patricia said, "We're partial owners of this property per the financial contribution we made, and we have a right to secure our investment." The locksmith looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I turned to him and said, "I'm the sole owner of this house. Do not touch my locks." He said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see documentation before I do any work." Blake jumped in and said, "We have documentation. Our lawyer sent her a letter." I pulled out my phone and said, "I'm calling the police right now if you don't leave." I started dialing 911. Patricia's expression turned even colder, but she held up a hand. The locksmith asked to see ownership papers and I said, "Wait here," went inside, and grabbed my deed from my file cabinet. I came back out and showed it to him. The deed had only my name on it, Natalie Crawford. No one else. The locksmith looked at Blake and my parents and said, "I can't proceed without a court order showing ownership interest. This deed is clear." Blake exploded. He started shouting about how this was bullshit and I was a selfish bitch and he couldn't believe I was humiliating them like this. The locksmith backed away toward his truck, saying he wanted no part of this. Richard tried to calm Blake down but Blake shoved him away. Melanie was filming everything on her phone. Patricia stood perfectly still, staring at me with such hatred I actually took a step back. She said very quietly, "You will regret this, Natalie. We will see you in court and we will take everything you have." Then they left. Blake still shouting as he got in his car. My father looking defeated. My mother radiating cold fury. The locksmith drove away immediately. I stood on my porch shaking. Neighbors peeking out their windows at the drama. Mrs. Kowalski from next door came out onto her porch and asked if I was all right. She was this elderly Polish woman, probably 80 years old, who'd lived there for decades. I said, "I'm fine. Just family issues." And she nodded slowly and said, "You call police if they come back. Don't wait." I thanked her and went inside. I called a different locksmith that afternoon and had all my locks changed. It cost me $300 I couldn't really afford with my reduced client list, but I needed to feel safe in my own home. I had them install deadbolts that needed keys from both sides. I ordered a Ring doorbell camera from Amazon and paid for overnight shipping. When it arrived Sunday, I installed it myself, mounting it next to my front door and connecting it to my phone. Now I'd have video evidence if they came back. I texted my neighbors on both sides, Mrs. Kowalski and a younger couple named the Johnsons, and explained that I was having issues with family members trying to access my property without permission. I asked if they could keep an eye out and call me if they saw anyone trying to get into my house. They both agreed immediately. Mrs. Kowalski came over that evening with a plate of cookies and said in her thick accent, "I know difficult family. I watch your house for you. Don't worry." I almost cried at this stranger's kindness when my own family was trying to destroy me. I thanked her and we sat on my porch eating cookies while I told her a sanitized version of what was happening. She just patted my hand and said, "You are a strong woman. You will be okay." Monday morning I met Stella at a coffee shop downtown. Shed asked me to bring all the documentation we'd compiled, and she had her laptop and a stack of folders. She ordered us both large lattes, and we grabbed a corner table. Stella had been working over the weekend, and she had news. She'd done some digging into my family's finances using publicly available records, and what she'd found was illuminating. She opened her laptop and showed me what she'd discovered. Blake's tech startup, the one that supposedly needed capital investment, was already registered with the state. She'd found the business filing. It was called Innovative Solutions Tech, and it had been founded 8 months ago. She'd also found reviews and complaints online. Turns out, Blake had already raised some money from investors and burned through it in 6 months with nothing to show for it. There were angry posts on business forums from people who'd invested and lost money. The startup was essentially dead already, though apparently Blake was trying to resurrect it with more funding. My equity. But that wasn't the worst of it. Stella had also looked into property records for Blake's Lake Oswego mansion. The house my parents bought him for $950,000 had a massive mortgage on it. Not a small loan, but a mortgage for nearly $800,000. My parents had only put down about $150,000, and they'd taken out this huge loan in their names. The monthly payment had to be astronomical, probably $5,000 or $6,000. Stella pulled up an amortization calculator and showed me the numbers. With their retirement income, there was no way they could afford that payment long term. They'd probably been helping Blake make the payments, draining their savings. She found more. Blake had taken out personal loans too, showing up in public records. Credit cards maxed out. He was drowning in debt despite his fancy house and car, or more accurately, because of them. Blake and Melanie were living way beyond their means, and my parents had enabled it. Now they were all in financial trouble and looking at my house as a life raft. I felt sick but also vindicated. This wasn't about family unity or investment opportunities. This was about desperation. They needed my equity to bail themselves out of terrible financial decisions. Stella leaned back and said, "Now we know what we're really dealing with, and knowledge is power." She suggested we write a detailed cease and desist letter to their attorney, include all our financial documentation proving I'd bought my house myself, and make it clear that any lawsuit would be frivolous and subject them to sanctions. She also suggested I consider filing for a restraining order given the pattern of harassment, the attempted lock-changing incident, the showing up at my house, the professional sabotage with my clients. All of it added up to a case for protection. I hesitated at the restraining order idea because it felt so final, like burning a bridge I could never rebuild. But Stella pointed out that they'd already burned the bridge. I was just protecting myself from the fire. We spent the rest of the morning drafting the cease and desist letter. Stella wrote it in formal legal language, citing statutes and case law, making it clear that their claim was baseless and any continued harassment would result in legal action against them. We attached copies of my bank statements, my loan documents, everything proving I'd bought my house independently. The letter demanded they immediately stop all contact with me. stop interfering with my business relationships, and withdraw their fraudulent financial claim. We sent it by certified mail to their attorney and directly to my parents' address. Stella said, give it a few days and see if they back down. But don't hold your breath, people this entitled usually have to learn the hard way. I thanked her for everything she was doing, and she waved me off saying that's what friends are for. Plus this is pissing me off on a professional level. I hate bullies. That Wednesday, 3 days after we sent the letters, something else happened that made everything more complicated. I was working at home, trying to focus on the few clients I had left, when my doorbell rang. I checked the Ring camera app on my phone and saw a man in a city uniform standing there with a clipboard. I went to the door and opened it cautiously. He identified himself as a code enforcement inspector and said he was following up on a complaint that had been filed about my property. My stomach dropped. I asked what kind of complaint, and he said someone had reported illegal modifications to the structure, potential safety violations, and unpermitted electrical work. I knew immediately this was my family's doing. I told him I hadn't made any illegal modifications. Everything I'd done was cosmetic and didn't require permits. He said he still needed to inspect to close out the complaint. It was procedure. I had no choice but to let him in. The inspector spent 45 minutes going through my house with his clipboard, checking outlets, looking at my walls, examining the ceiling. I followed him nervously, explaining what I'd done to fix the place up. Painted walls, refinished floors, updated some light fixtures, landscaped the yard. Nothing structural, nothing that needed permits. He took notes and photos. When he finished, he turned to me and said honestly, "Miss Crawford, everything here looks fine, up to code, no issues at all. This looks like what we call a harassment complaint." He asked if I was having disputes with anyone. Neighbors maybe, or family. I hesitated and then decided to be honest. I told him I was in a dispute with family members who wanted me to give them my house, and they'd been escalating their harassment. He nodded slowly and said, "I'll document this as an unfounded complaint. Note the possible false report, but you should know this goes in the city records." I asked if that would cause me problems and he said it could potentially affect future sales or refinancing because it shows a complaint was filed, even though it was cleared. I felt my anger rising. They were trying to damage my property's value on paper, make it harder for me to sell if I decided to escape this nightmare. After the inspector left, I called Stella and told her what happened. She added it to our growing file of harassment evidence. She said this actually helps our case for a restraining order. It shows a pattern of using official channels to harass me. That evening I sat on my porch with a glass of wine, looking at my garden and trying to process everything. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it cautiously. It was from Melanie, Blake's wife. The text said, "You're tearing this family apart. I hope you know that. Blake's parents are devastated, and it's all your fault." I didn't respond. I blocked the number and poured myself more wine. Mrs. Kowalski came out onto her porch and waved at me. I waved back, grateful for this stranger who'd shown me more kindness than my own family. She called over asking if I was okay and I said yes. "Just a long day." She said I made too much soup. "You want some?" I said yes please and she disappeared inside. 5 minutes later, she came over with a container of homemade chicken soup that smelled incredible. We sat together on my porch steps and she told me about her own family troubles decades ago. How she'd come to America alone and built a life away from toxic relatives. She said sometimes the family you choose is better than the family you're born with, and I felt tears prick my eyes because she was right. The weeks after the code enforcement incident were tense but quiet. Too quiet. I kept waiting for the next attack, checking my Ring camera obsessively, jumping every time my phone buzzed. Stella said we should take advantage of the silence to strengthen our position, so I spent time documenting everything and trying to rebuild my client base. I reached out to former clients and colleagues, explained that I was dealing with some family drama that had been resolved, and was available for new projects. Some people responded warmly, others ignored me. I took every small job I could get, working late into the night to prove I was reliable. Slowly, painfully, my income started creeping back up. Then came the invitation that I knew would be a disaster but couldn't bring myself to decline: Thanksgiving at Aunt Carol's house. She sent a group email to the whole family, including me, either out of obligation or because she genuinely didn't think I'd show up. The email was cheerful and oblivious, talking about turkey and pie and family togetherness. I stared at it for hours, debating. Stella said, "Don't go, it's a trap, you don't owe them anything." But some stubborn part of me wanted to face them, wanted to show them they hadn't broken me. Thanksgiving morning I got dressed carefully, choosing a nice sweater and jeans, doing my makeup like armor. Stella had offered to come with me for moral support, and I'd gratefully accepted. We drove to Aunt Carol's house in the suburbs together, Stella giving me a pep talk the whole way. She said, "Remember, you've done nothing wrong. You're the victim here. Don't let them gaslight you into thinking otherwise." We pulled up to the house and I saw all the familiar cars already there. My parents' SUV, Blake's Tesla, Uncle Raymond's truck, Cousin Jennifer's Honda. My hands started shaking. Stella squeezed my arm and said, "Well, stay an hour, show your face, then leave. You can do this." We walked up to the front door, and I rang the bell. Aunt Carol opened it with a huge smile that faltered when she saw me. She recovered quickly and said, "Natalie, so glad you could make it, come in." We walked into the house and the conversation in the living room stopped dead. Everyone turned to look at us. The seating arrangement told me everything I needed to know. Blake and Melanie were sitting in the places of honor on the main couch. My parents flanked them in the good armchairs. Aunt Carol and Uncle Raymond had the love seat. Cousin Jennifer and her husband had dining chairs they'd brought in. And there, off to the side by the kids' table where Aunt Carol's young grandchildren were coloring, was a single folding chair. That was my seat. I was 32 years old with a master's degree and a house I'd bought myself. And they'd put me at the kids' table. Stella saw it too and I felt her tense beside me. I walked over to the folding chair and sat down, Stella grabbing another chair from the dining room and sitting next to me. The room slowly resumed conversation, but it was forced and awkward. Patricia wouldn't look at me. Richard glanced over once with what might have been regret. Blake smirked into his drink. Melanie whispered something to Aunt Carol and they both looked at me. Aunt Carol announced dinner was ready and everyone moved to the dining room. The table was beautiful, covered in dishes that smelled amazing. And again the seating was telling. The head of the table for Uncle Raymond, then my parents on either side, Blake and Melanie next to them. I was at the far end, practically in the kitchen, with Stella beside me. We all sat down and Uncle Raymond said grace, thanking God for family and togetherness and love, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at the hypocrisy. We started passing food and making plates. Conversation flowed around me like I wasn't there. Patricia made a big show of asking Blake about his business plans. He launched into this speech about his new startup idea, how he just needed some capital to get it off the ground, how it was going to revolutionize something or other. Melanie gazed at him adoringly. My parents nodded along like he was describing the cure for cancer. When he finished, Patricia said, "We're so proud of you, Blake, you're going to do amazing things." Then she looked down the table at me for the first time and said, "It's so nice when children make their parents proud." The implication was crystal clear. Blake made them proud. I did not. I felt Stella's hand on my knee under the table, a warning to stay calm. I took a bite of turkey and said nothing. But Patricia wasn't done. She cleared her throat and said, "You know, family is about sacrifice and putting others first. Something Blake has always understood. Has always been so generous and thoughtful." I looked up and caught Blake's eyes and he was smiling, enjoying this. Aunt Carol jumped in. Clueless or complicit I couldn't tell, saying Blake has always been such a good boy. Even as a child he shared everything. Melanie added, "We believe in family values, in taking care of each other." The whole table was nodding along. I realized they'd planned this. A coordinated effort to shame me publicly. Uncle Raymond decided to get more direct. He turned to me and said, "Natalie, when are you going to stop being stubborn and do what's right for this family?" The whole table went quiet. I put down my fork and said, "Excuse me?" He barreled on, clearly emboldened by the audience. "Your parents need help. Blake needs support. And you're sitting on resources that could make a difference. It's selfish and it needs to stop." Aunt Carol added, "We all make sacrifices, dear. That's what family means." Cousin Jennifer, who hadn't said a word to me in weeks, finally looked at me and said, "I used to think you were smart, Nat, but this whole situation has really disappointed me." And something inside me snapped. I'd come here hoping for some kind of reconciliation or understanding, but all I was getting was more manipulation and blame. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor. Stella stood too, ready to back me up. Everyone stared at me. I took a breath and said, "You want to know the truth? All of you? Let me tell you the truth." I walked to the center of the room where everyone could see me clearly. My voice was shaking but loud. I said my parents gave Blake a house worth $950,000. They paid for his college, his car, everything he's ever needed handed to him on a silver platter. They gave me nothing. Not $1 for college. Not $1 for my house. I worked 3 jobs to save enough to buy my tiny house myself. I have bank statements proving every penny came from my own accounts. Then my parents decided they wanted to take equity out of my house to fund Blake's failing business ventures. I pulled out my phone and pulled up the documents Stella had helped me organize. I held it up and said, "Blake's startup already failed once. He's in massive debt, their mansion in Lake Oswego has a mortgage payment they can't afford. And now they want to drain my equity to bail themselves out. That's the truth. They asked me to sign over my house and I said no, because it's mine and I earned it." The room erupted. Aunt Carol said, "Patricia, is this true?" My mother's face was pale but she drew herself up and said, "She's exaggerating. We were trying to set up a family trust to help everyone." I said, "That's a lie. You wanted to take out loans against my house for Blake and you know it." Uncle Raymond looked uncomfortable now, glancing between me and my parents. Cousin Jennifer's mouth was hanging open. I kept going, the words pouring out of me. I said, "Since I refused, they've launched a campaign to destroy me. They told everyone I was selfish without explaining what they'd asked me to do. They contacted my clients and lied about me. I lost 30% of my income. They sent me a fraudulent lawyer's letter claiming they'd given me money they never gave me. They tried to change my locks. They filed a false complaint with the city, all because I wouldn't give them my house. I'm not the villain here. I'm not the one tearing this family apart. They did this by treating me like I'm not a person, just a resource to exploit." Blake jumped to his feet, his face red. He shouted, "You entitled brat. Everything was fine until you decided to be selfish." He took a step toward me and Uncle Raymond grabbed his arm. Blake tried to shake him off, still shouting, "That house should be mine. You don't deserve anything. You've never deserved anything." And there it was, the mask finally dropping. Everyone in the room could see his true nature now. The golden child having a tantrum because someone told him no. Richard stood up and tried to calm Blake down but Blake shoved him hard. My father stumbled back against the table. Melanie was shrieking at Blake to calm down. Patricia just sat frozen, her carefully constructed narrative falling apart. Aunt Carol looked horrified. Cousin Jennifer was staring at Blake like she'd never seen him before. Uncle Raymond was still holding Blake back, saying, "That's enough, that's enough." I looked around at all of them and said, "I'm done. I'm done with all of this. I'm done being the scapegoat for this family's dysfunction. I'm done being blamed for refusing to be exploited. If you want a relationship with me, it starts with an apology and changed behavior. Otherwise, I'm out." I walked toward the door and Stella followed immediately. Behind us, the room erupted in arguments. I could hear Aunt Carol demanding explanations from Patricia, Uncle Raymond saying this has gone too far, Cousin Jennifer crying, Blake still yelling, his voice cracking. We walked out into the cold November air and I took a huge breath. My whole body was shaking. Stella put her arm around me and said, "I'm so proud of you, that took guts." We got in her car and drove away from the chaos. I waited to feel guilty or sad, but all I felt was relief. I'd finally told the truth. I'd finally stood up for myself. Whatever came next, at least I'd done that. The day after Thanksgiving, Stella went into full legal mode. She spent Friday drafting a comprehensive cease and desist letter that would go to my parents, Blake, and their attorney. This one was stronger than the first version we'd sent, citing specific instances of harassment with dates and details. The attempted lock-changing incident, the false complaint to code enforcement, the interference with my business relationships, the fraudulent claim of having given me money, the threatening behavior at Aunt Carol's house. Stella laid it all out in precise legal language, making it clear that this pattern of behavior constituted harassment and possibly extortion. She demanded they immediately cease all contact with me, stop spreading false information about me to family and business contacts, and formally withdraw their financial claim against my property. She stated that failure to comply would result in me filing for a restraining order and pursuing a lawsuit for damages to my business and reputation. She copied it all to their attorney and sent everything by certified mail so we'd have proof of delivery. While Stella handled the legal side, I focused on documenting everything we had. I created a detailed timeline in a spreadsheet with every incident from the day they demanded my house to the Thanksgiving blow-up. Every text message, every email, every phone call, every in-person confrontation. I included dates, times, witnesses when applicable, and attached screenshots or recordings. The Ring doorbell footage of them showing up with the locksmith. The city inspector's report clearing my house of violations. My bank statements proving I'd saved for and bought my house myself. The emails from clients who'd canceled, one of whom had admitted my mother contacted them. Messages from the family group chat showing how they'd turned everyone against me. It was dozens of pages when printed out, a comprehensive record of their harassment campaign. Stella organized it all into a legal brief in case we needed to go to court. We also filed a police report. I hadn't wanted to involve the police because it felt like such an escalation, but Stella insisted we needed an official record. We went to the Portland Police Bureau and I gave a statement about the attempted lock-changing incident and the pattern of harassment. The officer who took the report was kind and professional. He explained that while individual incidents might seem minor, the pattern could constitute criminal harassment under Oregon law. He gave me a case number and said to call immediately if they showed up at my property again. He also suggested I consider filing for a stalking protective order if the behavior continued. Having that police report made everything feel more real and more serious. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was documented criminal behavior. Then the financial house of cards started collapsing for Blake and my parents, and I learned about it through cousin Jennifer. She called me Sunday evening, 2 days after Thanksgiving, and her voice was shaky. She apologized for not believing me, for taking their side without hearing mine, for everything. She said Aunt Carol had confronted Patricia after we left, and the truth had come spilling out. My parents had taken out that massive mortgage on Blake's house and were barely making the payments. They'd also co-signed loans for Blake's business that were now in default. Blake was in debt up to his eyeballs and his latest investor had pulled out after doing basic due diligence and discovering the previous failed startup. Jennifer said the whole family was reeling from finding out how bad things really were. Uncle Raymond was furious at being manipulated. Aunt Carol felt betrayed. Other relatives were reaching out to me now, apologizing, asking to hear my side. The narrative my parents had so carefully constructed was crumbling. By the following Wednesday, Blake's business officially collapsed. Jennifer sent me a link to a local business news site that had a small article about innovative solutions tech filing for bankruptcy. The article mentioned that the startup had failed to secure adequate funding and would be dissolving with significant debts to creditors. I felt no satisfaction reading it, just a kind of sad inevitability. This was what my parents had wanted to sacrifice my house for, a business that was doomed from the start. Thursday morning, I got a notification that someone was at my door. I checked my Ring camera and saw Patricia standing there alone. She looked terrible. Her hair wasn't perfectly styled like usual. She wasn't wearing makeup. She looked like she'd been crying. I watched her on the camera for a moment, debating whether to open the door. She rang the bell again. I opened the app's two-way audio and said, "What do you want?" She looked up at the camera, startled. Then, she started talking, her voice breaking. She said, "Please, Natalie, we need to talk. We're going to lose everything." I said, "You should have thought of that before you tried to steal my house." She said, "Please, I'm begging you, your father and I are going to be homeless. The bank is foreclosing on Blake's house. We used it as collateral for loans and we can't make the payments. We'll have nowhere to go." I felt a sick twist in my stomach, but I kept my voice firm. I said, "And you thought you'd use my house as collateral too, put me in debt to save yourselves?" Patricia said, "We thought we could manage it. We thought it would work out. You're so much more responsible than Blake. You would have been fine." And there it was. The truth she probably didn't even realize she was admitting. They were willing to sacrifice me because I was responsible, because I'd figure it out, because I always had. I said through the camera, "You had a choice. You've always had choices. You chose Blake over me my entire life, every single time. And now you're facing the consequences of those choices." She was crying now, real tears streaming down her face. She said, "He's our son, we had to help him." I said, "I'm your daughter and you never helped me, you only wanted to use me." Patricia said, "Please, we're family, families help each other." I said, "You didn't treat me like family. You treated me like a resource to exploit when it was convenient. I'm not your backup plan. I'm not your safety net. You need to leave my property and not come back." She stood there for another moment, looking up at the camera like she couldn't believe I was really saying no. Then she said, "You'll regret this. When your father and I are living on the streets, you'll have to live with that." I said, "You made your choices, now live with the consequences." And I ended the audio connection. I watched her stand there for another minute before she finally walked back to her car and drove away. My hands were shaking as I immediately called Stella and told her what happened. She said, "Was it recorded?" I said, "Yes, the Ring camera got everything." She said, "Perfect, send me the video." "That's a confession. She admitted they were going to use your house as collateral without your knowledge. This actually helps our case significantly. We added it to our growing mountain of evidence." That evening, Stella called me back with news. Their attorney had responded to our cease and desist letter. The response was brief and professional. It stated that his clients denied all allegations of harassment but would cease contact with me going forward. The financial claim against my property was being withdrawn without prejudice, which Stella explained meant they were dropping it but technically could refile later, though she doubted they would since they had no case. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was something. Stella said, "Well, give it a week and see if they actually honor the cease contact provision. If they don't, we file for the restraining order." That week was quiet but tense. I kept checking my Ring camera obsessively, expecting them to show up again. They didn't. I started getting messages from extended family members. Cousin Jennifer kept apologizing and asking if we could meet for coffee. Aunt Carol sent a long email saying she was horrified by what Patricia had done and wanted to maintain a relationship with me separate from my parents. Uncle Raymond called and left a voicemail saying he owed me an apology and hadn't understood the full situation. Even some of my parents' friends reached out. People who'd heard the story through the family grapevine and wanted to tell me they supported me. The social isolation was reversing. People were taking my side now that the truth was out. I responded to some messages and ignored others, still feeling raw and not ready to let people back in just because they'd finally decided to believe me. The legal victory came faster than expected. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, Stella got a formal letter from my parents' attorney stating that his clients were officially withdrawing their financial claim against my property, with prejudice this time, meaning they couldn't refile. The letter also stated they acknowledged no legal claim to my house and would have no further contact with me. It was the closest it'd get to an admission that they'd been wrong. Stella also got the city to formally expunge the false complaint from my property records. Shed sent them copies of the inspector's report and our harassment documentation, and they agreed to remove it completely so it wouldn't affect any future sale or refinancing. The Code Enforcement Office even sent me a letter apologizing for the inconvenience and noting that filing false complaints was a misdemeanor they took seriously. Everything was slowly being set right on paper, even if the emotional damage would take much longer to heal. The restraining order ended up not being necessary because they actually stopped contacting me. I didn't hear from my parents or Blake at all. No calls, no texts, no showing up at my house. The silence was strange after months of constant harassment, but it was also peaceful. I could finally breathe without waiting for the next attack. My business started recovering too. Word had spread through the professional community about what happened, and several potential clients reached out specifically because they'd heard my story and respected how I'd handled it. Within 2 months my income was back to where it had been before my mother sabotaged me, and within 4 months it was actually higher. I took on interesting projects, raised my rates, got pickier about who I worked with. The crisis had forced me to level up professionally in ways I hadn't expected. The family fractures became permanent in some cases and healed in others. Cousin Jennifer and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. She came over for coffee on my porch one Saturday morning in December and we talked for hours. She explained how Patricia had always been manipulative, how Shed controlled the family narrative for years, and how nobody had questioned it until I forced them to see the truth. Jennifer apologized repeatedly for not believing me sooner. She said Shed started going to therapy to deal with her own family issues and was realizing how toxic the dynamics had always been. We didn't go back to how we were before. Too much had happened. But we built something new that felt more honest. Aunt Carol also stayed in my life. She called regularly, invited me to family gatherings that didn't include my parents, and made it clear she was on my side. Uncle Raymond was more awkward about it, but he tried, sending occasional texts checking in on me. Blake's downfall was complete and public. The bankruptcy finalized in January, listing hundreds of thousands in debts to creditors, investors, and banks. The Lake Oswego mansion went into foreclosure and was sold at auction in February for much less than it was worth. Blake and Melanie had to move into a small 2-bedroom apartment in a not great neighborhood. Then in March, Jennifer told me that Melanie had filed for divorce. Apparently Shed married Blake for his potential and the lifestyle she thought he'd provide, and when that all disappeared, she saw no reason to stay. The divorce was ugly with fights over the few assets they had left. Blake had to get a regular job working in sales at a tech company, a massive come-down from being a startup founder. I heard through the family grapevine that he was bitter and angry, still blaming everyone else for his problems, still insisting he'd been on the verge of success if only people had believed in him. He never learned, never took responsibility, never changed. My parents' consequences were similarly severe. They were forced to sell the Lake Oswego mansion even before the foreclosure completed, trying to get ahead of the bank seizure. They sold it at a loss and used the money to pay off some of their debts, but not all of them. Richard's retirement savings that had spent 30 years building were completely gone, drained paying for Blake's lifestyle and failed businesses. They had to move into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, the kind of place Patricia would have sneered at a year earlier. Her social standing in their community was destroyed. Friends distanced themselves once the truth came out about the manipulation and lies. She got dropped from the charity boards she'd been on. The country club membership they couldn't afford anymore anyway was quietly not renewed. Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years in 6 months. I saw them once from a distance at a grocery store in March and almost didn't recognize them. I found unexpected allies too. Mrs. Kowalski from next door became a regular presence in my life. I learned she was a retired real estate attorney who had practiced for 40 years before retiring. When I mentioned this casually, she laughed and said, "Yes, I know property law very well. Why do you think I offered to help watch your house?" She'd seen immediately what was happening and had positioned herself as a subtle protector. We started having coffee on my porch every Saturday morning, a ritual that became one of my favorite parts of the week. She told me stories about her own life, fleeing Poland as a young woman, building a career in a male-dominated field, cutting off toxic family members who tried to drag her down. She became the grandmother figure I'd never had, tough and wise and endlessly supportive. When I thanked her once for being so kind to a stranger, she said, "You're not a stranger, you're my neighbor, and we take care of our own." The community support was unexpected and moving. My story had gotten out through social media and local networks, and I started getting messages from complete strangers who'd been through similar situations with their families. Some people just wanted to say they supported me. Others asked for advice on how to handle their own toxic family members. A local newspaper even reached out asking to interview me about standing up to family financial abuse. I declined the interview because I wasn't ready for that level of publicity. But the reporter told me the story resonated because it was more common than people realized, families using guilt and obligation to exploit the responsible members. I started a private blog where I wrote about my experience, not using real names but sharing the emotional journey and what I'd learned. It helped me process everything, and the comments from readers going through similar situations helped me feel less alone. I also started therapy in January. I'd been resistant to it for years, telling myself I was fine, but after everything that happened, I knew I needed help processing decades of being the scapegoat. My therapist was this calm woman in her 50s named Dr. Chen, who specialized in family trauma. She helped me understand the dynamics I'd grown up in, the golden child and scapegoat roles, how narcissistic family systems work. She validated that what I'd experienced was abuse, emotional and financial, and that my response had been healthy and appropriate. We worked on the guilt I still felt, the voice in my head that wondered if I should have just given them the house to keep the peace. She helped me see that voice wasn't mine, it was theirs, internalized over 32 years of conditioning. Slowly, session by session, I started to feel lighter. I started to believe I deserved good things. I started to trust my own judgment again. 1 year later, I'm sitting on the porch of my house on a Saturday morning in late November. The garden I planted is dormant for winter, but I can see where the roses will bloom again in spring, the irises that will come back purple and yellow, the lavender that fills the air with scent in summer. Stella is here for our monthly brunch, something we started doing after everything settled down. Mrs. Kowalski is walking over from next door with a plate of something that smells like cinnamon and apples. This is my family now. The one I chose. The one that chose me back. We sit together in the weak autumn sunshine, drinking coffee and laughing about something silly, and I feel more at peace than I ever did at those big family gatherings where I was tolerated but never truly welcomed. My business is thriving beyond what I imagined possible. I doubled my income from where it was a year ago, took on clients I'm actually excited about, and started saying no to projects that don't serve me. I paid down my mortgage aggressively all year, making extra payments whenever I could. My house is now worth about $230,000 according to recent comparable sales in the neighborhood. The market went up. I refinanced in September at a much better interest rate, lowering my monthly payment and saving thousands over the life of the loan. I'm financially secure in a way I've never been before. I even started a small emergency fund, something I never had before because I was always living paycheck to paycheck. The house they tried to take from me became the foundation of a stability they never wanted me to have. The apology I kept hoping for never came. Not from my parents, not from Blake. Patricia and Richard never reached out after that day she showed up at my door begging. Blake sent exactly one text message about 6 months ago that said "Hope you're happy now," and I blocked his number immediately. I still occasionally see my mother's car drive slowly past my house. The Ring camera catches it sometimes, but she never stops and never tries to contact me. The restraining order expired after a year and I didn't renew it because they'd honored the cease contact provision. But the lack of apology was its own answer. They're incapable of taking accountability. They genuinely believe they were entitled to my house, and I was wrong to refuse. That realization was painful but also freeing. I stopped waiting for them to validate my worth. I stopped needing their approval. I just let them go. Cousin Jennifer came over on a Tuesday evening in October and we sat in my living room drinking wine. She'd been doing her own work in therapy, dealing with how Patricia had manipulated her and the whole family for years. She apologized again for not believing me immediately, and I told her I'd forgiven her. We'd both been victims of the same manipulation. She told me the extended family had mostly split into two camps. Some people maintained relationships with my parents out of obligation or genuine affection, and some had cut them off completely. Nobody was neutral anymore. Everyone had to choose a side once the truth came out. Jennifer said Uncle Raymond barely spoke to Patricia anymore. Aunt Carol had uninvited my parents from Christmas. The family structure we'd all grown up with was permanently fractured. I felt sad about that sometimes, but I also knew it had been built on lies and favoritism and dysfunction. Maybe it needed to break so something healthier could grow. The unexpected letter came in September. I found it in my mailbox one afternoon. A handwritten envelope with my father's distinctive scrawl. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. The letter inside was 2 pages, written in blue ink on lined notebook paper. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. Richard wrote that he'd been wrong. That he'd been weak. That he'd let Patricia control everything for too long. He said he'd failed me as a father by always putting Blake first and treating me like I was less important. He wrote that he was proud of me for standing up for myself, for being strong enough to say no when he never could. He didn't make excuses, and he didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said he wanted me to know the truth, that he saw now what they'd done to me my whole life. The letter ended with "I understand if you never want to speak to me again, I just needed you to know I'm sorry." I sat on my couch and cried reading it. Not because it fixed anything or made up for 32 years of neglect, but because it was honest in a way my father had never been before. I didn't respond to the letter. I folded it carefully and put it in a box with all my other important documents. Maybe someday I'll be ready to reach out to him. Maybe someday I'll want to rebuild some kind of relationship with my father, separate from my mother, if that's even possible. But not today. Not now. The wound is still too fresh. For now I'm focusing on my own healing, my own life, my own future. I learned my worth isn't determined by family approval. I learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's survival. I learned that chosen family can be stronger and more real than blood family. I learned that my home isn't just property, or square footage or equity. It's my proof that I'm enough exactly as I am. I heard through the grapevine about Blake's ongoing struggles. He's working a regular job that he hates, living in that small apartment, dating someone new who apparently doesn't know his history. He's still telling people that his business would have succeeded if his family had supported him. Still blaming me for refusing to help. Still learning nothing from his mistakes. Jennifer said he showed up at a family gathering recently and spent the whole time complaining about how unfair his life was. Nobody had much sympathy anymore. Even the people who'd supported him during the original conflict had started to see through him. The golden child had tarnished and there was no polishing him back to shine. I felt nothing when I heard about his struggles. Not satisfaction, not anger, not even pity, just a kind of empty indifference that told me I'd finally healed enough to stop caring what happened to him. I've been thinking about the future more lately. I might stay in this house for decades or I might eventually sell and buy something bigger. I'm thinking about adopting a dog, a rescue who needs a second chance like I did. I've been researching breed types and visiting shelters, imagining coming home to wagging tails and unconditional love. I've also been thinking about fostering teenagers through the state system, kids who need a safe place and someone to believe in them. I have this extra bedroom that's currently my office, but could be converted. I know what it's like to feel unwanted by the people who are supposed to love you, and maybe I could help someone else get through that. My therapist says that desire to help others heal is a sign. I'm healing myself. That I'm taking my pain and turning it into purpose. I'm also writing a book. Not this story exactly, but a guide for people dealing with family financial abuse and manipulation. All the research I did, all the legal strategies Stella taught me, all the emotional work with Dr. Chen, I want to share it so others don't have to figure it out alone like I did. I've been working on it for months now, writing late into the night after my design work is done. Stella's helping me with the legal sections. Dr. Chen agreed to write a chapter about the psychological dynamics. Mrs. Kowalski is reading drafts and giving feedback. It might never get published, but the act of writing it is healing in itself. Taking everything terrible that happened and transforming it into something that might help someone else survive their own toxic family. The sun is setting over Portland now, painting the sky orange and pink. I water my dormant garden with the hose, giving the roots what they need to survive winter and bloom again. Mrs. Kowalski waves from her porch where she's reading a book. Stella texts asking if I want to meet for drinks next week. A potential new client emails asking about my availability. My house creaks and settles around me, solid and safe and completely mine. I look at this little 2-bedroom house that they tried so hard to take from me and I smile. We made it. We survived. I'm Natalie Crawford. I'm 33 now, and this is still my house. To anyone out there facing family who won't take no for an answer, who feels guilty for protecting what's yours, who wonders if they're being selfish for having boundaries, hear this. Your no is a complete sentence. You don't owe anyone your security or your peace or the things you've worked for. Not even family. Especially not family who only sees you as a resource to exploit. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from people who don't respect you. Sometimes the family you make is better than the family you were born into. You deserve to feel safe. You deserve to keep what you've earned. You deserve people in your life who celebrate your success instead of trying to take it from you. Don't let anyone make you feel bad for protecting yourself. You're not responsible for fixing other people's bad decisions. You're not required to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who tried to take advantage of you? Have you dealt with the golden child and scapegoat dynamic in your own family? Drop a comment below and share your story. You're not alone in this. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you. And please subscribe to this channel because sharing these real-life experiences helps all of us feel less isolated in our struggles. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that it's okay to protect yourself from toxic family members. Your boundaries matter. Your hard work matters. You matter. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I know it was long and heavy, but if you made it this far, it means something in here connected with you. I hope it gave you strength if you're going through something similar. I hope it reminded you that you're not crazy for feeling hurt by family who should love you better. I hope it showed you that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's self-preservation. Whatever you're facing, whatever boundaries you need to set, I'm rooting for you. You've got this. Be kind to yourself. Protect your peace. And remember that the right people will respect your boundaries instead of punishing you for having them. Sending love and strength to everyone out there fighting their own battles with family dysfunction. You deserve better. Don't ever forget that.